Airships are like ships, but they do not sail on the sea. They can fly, yet they never seem as eager as airplanes to escape gravity. They are huge, slow, and quiet, more like floating buildings than vehicles.
From the very beginning, airships carried a very different kind of presence from other flying machines. Through the airship, people were trying to lift the way of life on the ground into the sky. That is why the imagination attached to airships has always gone far beyond the idea of ordinary transportation.
When airships were still fragile experiments, fiction had already sent them into wilderness and faraway lands. Once they began to resemble real transportation, people quickly reimagined them as ocean liners of the sky. Then they became flying warships, imperial machines, floating airports, even nuclear-powered sky islands that never needed to land. So, in this video, we are not just looking at airships themselves, we are tracing their other history, a brief history of airship fantasy.
The fantasy history of airships did not begin at the height of their glory. It began much earlier. By the late 19th century, Europe and America had already witnessed the shock of hot air balloons. For the first time, humans had truly left the ground and risen into the sky. But the limits of balloons were obvious. They could rise, yet they could not truly be steered. That meant humanity had learned how to fly, but not yet how to travel through the air the way one could steer a ship or drive a vehicle. And that was exactly what made the early airship so fascinating. It was imagined as a vessel that could sail through the sky. But in the late 19th century, airships were still unstable in almost every practical sense. Their structural materials, power systems, and methods of control were all unreliable. Truly dependable airships, capable of long flights and real transport, had not yet emerged. Yet reality could not stop the imagination, and so the airship first took off in fiction. By the end of the 19th century, a particular kind of popular adventure literature had become common in the United States. These stories often revolved around boy inventors, strange machines, distant lands, and unknown worlds. In that setting, airships, or various kinds of ships of the air, were the perfect vehicles for adventure. The reason was simple. Movement on the ground was still heavily restricted. Trains depended on rails, ships depended on seas and rivers, and carriages could travel only on land. But the airship seemed to escape all of those limits. In the imagination of the 19th century, it became the freest vehicle of all. It could cross mountains, forests, swamps, and wilderness, and reach the distant edges of the map with ease. One of the most representative examples of this kind of imagination was the 1894 story Frank Reed Jr.'s Catamaran of the Air. The title itself says a great deal. It did not call the machine an airplane. It called it a catamaran of the air. That reveals how people at the time understood aerial travel. They were still borrowing the language of navigation and seafaring. They did not imagine the airship as a completely alien new machine, but as a ship lifted into the sky. And that shaped its basic image in fantasy from the very beginning. From the start, the airship was not imagined as a machine built purely for speed. It was more like a vehicle for long journeys, exploration, and the crossing of the unknown. It did not merely carry people from point A to point B, it allowed them to enter another realm through the act of voyaging. And because it was a ship, its role in these early stories was not limited to movement. It was also a stage for the story itself. People lived inside it, hid from danger inside it, and prepared inside it before entering unknown worlds. In that sense, the airship very quickly gained a special quality in fantasy. It was not just a vehicle, but a space capable of carrying an entire story.
Interestingly, this image of the airship as a vehicle of adventure did not remain confined to fiction. In 1926, Roald Amundsen and his team crossed the North Pole aboard the airship Norge, creating what remains one of the most iconic real-world links between airships and the spirit of exploration. In the late 19th century, the airship was associated not first with industry or war, but with adventure. Long before the technology had truly matured in reality, literature had already turned it into a symbol of courage and curiosity. By the beginning of the 20th century, the position of the airship had changed. In the late 19th century, it was still little more than an unstable idea, but once the 20th century began, and especially after the rise of the Zeppelin, something shifted. The airship began to feel like a vehicle that might actually be operated in the real world. The Zeppelin was not only able to fly farther and more steadily, it also offered a scale of internal space that aeroplanes of the time could not match. For the first time, people could seriously imagine a system in the sky that resembled maritime travel. That is why airship fantasy in the early 20th century expanded so quickly from flying machine to ocean liner of the air. To step aboard an airship was imagined as stepping aboard a ship in the sky. People could travel, rest, and socialize inside it, spending time much as they would on an ocean liner. The difference was that the entire setting had been lifted from the sea into the air. That desire for aerial travel quickly produced a flood of engineering fantasies. In scientific magazines and concept illustrations of the time, people repeatedly drew giant passenger liners floating through the sky. They often appeared in books and magazines in more or less the same form, a massive airship gliding above the clouds, still retaining the long, streamlined Zeppelin silhouette, but with its gondola no longer treated as a simple cabin. Instead, it had been expanded into 3 full decks of airborne passenger space. The top deck would be a viewing promenade, lined with arched windows facing the sea of clouds, where passengers in formal dress stood at the rail with glasses of champagne in hand. The middle deck would contain dining rooms and reception halls, with grand chandeliers, rows of round tables, pianos, and live music. More like the first-class interior of a luxury ocean liner than a machine for flight. The lower deck would hold sleeping cabins, smoking rooms, reading lounges, and even a small ballroom. Magazines would give these visions names that were as direct as they were grand. The Airliner of Tomorrow, or the Sky Ocean Palace. And beneath the title, the caption might read, "From New York to Paris, no longer merely a journey, but a social season drifting above the clouds."
Later, the famous Hindenburg was built along exactly this line of thinking. The journey itself was presented as a lifestyle, meant to be displayed, experienced, and consumed.
One feature defines this stage of airship fantasy very clearly. It was always imitating the luxury ocean liner, but it also insisted on going beyond it. An ocean liner could offer comfort. The airship had to offer comfort plus wonder. An ocean liner could promise a transoceanic voyage. The airship had to promise a transoceanic voyage plus a view of the world from above. That is why these imagined airships were often packed with things that were not strictly necessary. Oversized viewing windows, promenade decks, dedicated ballrooms, bars, smoking lounges, even indoor gardens and skywalking terraces. Taken together, these details suggest that what people ultimately wanted to build aboard the airship was a kind of upper-class society in the sky. It was a classic early 20th century modernist illusion that technology would keep improving, and life would therefore become more comfortable, more refined, and more elegant. And the airship, perhaps more than any other machine of its age, was the perfect vessel for that illusion.
But the dream was quickly shattered by reality. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had believed that reason and technology would lead humanity into a more civilized and orderly future. History soon proved otherwise. Human fragility and complexity were never enough to sustain that illusion. Technology does not automatically lead humanity towards civilization. On the contrary, the very things once seen as proof of reason, progress, and modernity were soon reinterpreted through war. The First World War was the moment when that transformation truly took place. Airships were no longer merely engineering marvels, no longer simply symbols of future transportation. They entered public experience in a darker and far more immediate form. It was especially in night bombing that the airship created an entirely new image of terror. Unlike the airplanes that would later flash past at high speed, the airship appeared slowly, silently, and massively in the night sky. When it hung above a city, what people felt first was not the explosion itself, but a sustained pressure rising out of the darkness. That sensation was something entirely new. The threats of traditional war had mostly come from the horizon, from land, from sea, but the airship lifted war above the city. It was like a flying fortress advancing slowly through the dark. Its vast gas envelope, the suspended gondola beneath it, the searchlights and fire in the night, together they transformed a sky once filled with stars into something like a shroud hanging over the city. It created an image of terror unlike anything people had seen before. It was then that people began to understand that if technology could promise such beautiful futures, it could also produce equally terrifying darkness.
This imagination of the airship as a national and militarized machine was later amplified and fixed in works of fiction. One of the clearest examples is the giant military airship Goliath in Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky. Of course, Castle in the Sky is a work from 1986, so it does not belong to the original era in which these fantasies first emerged. That means Goliath is not the starting point of this imagination, but rather a later distillation of earlier 20th century ideas. The imperial airship, the aerial fortress, the airborne machine of state power. What matters most about Goliath is not whether it corresponds to any specific historical airship, but that it captures the core atmosphere of this fantasy so precisely. It is huge, heavy, and enclosed, almost completely stripped of the elegance and comfort that defined the airborne ocean line of fantasy of the previous chapter. It is meant to inspire fear. It is a steel fortress lifted into the sky, slow, massive, and overwhelming in its sheer presence.
And in that same period, one could find countless military fantasies built around the airship. Among them were various visions of airborne aircraft carriers, such as the air wing concept published in Popular Science in 1943. This was no ordinary airship, but a giant flying machine imagined as both a passenger and cargo carrier and an aerial aircraft carrier. It could serve as a transport for people and goods, but also function as an aerial aircraft carrier, with a proposed flight deck roughly 180 feet wide and 200 feet long, capable of handling up to 12 fighter aircraft. The United States even attempted to turn part of this fantasy into reality. In the 1930s, the U.S. Navy built two large airships, USS Akron and USS Macon. They were not just ordinary airships, but true flying aircraft carriers.
Each could carry small parasite aircraft inside and launch or recover them in mid-air using a specialized trapeze system, sometimes described as an aerial swing. Although the flying aircraft carrier path ultimately failed, and large airships never became the true protagonists of future warfare, the imagination it left behind was extremely powerful. In fact, it was not only war that shattered the beautiful imagination of the airship. There was also the single most important and symbolically charged event in airship history, the Hindenburg disaster. This catastrophe took place between the two world wars. In terms of timing, it feels like a rupture suspended between the dream of the old era and the violence of the new one. Before it, the airship still retained traces of other meanings: the airborne ocean liner, the vehicle of the future, the symbol of elegant travel. But the images of the Hindenburg burning and collapsing as it came into land tore those lingering visions apart. It showed with brutal clarity and theatrical force that this enormous, graceful, seemingly composed machine of the sky could turn into a mass of fire in seconds. From that moment on, the airship was no longer only a symbol of romance and the future. It became inseparably tied to disaster, loss of control, and death.
It is worth noting that the Hindenburg disaster was not a total loss of life. The accident claimed 36 lives, but a large number of people on board survived. What was truly destroyed was not only the airship itself, but also public confidence in the safety of airships and in their future. War and disaster changed the public image of the airship. But war also changed the structure of the sky itself. It forced the airplane to evolve rapidly, and when the smoke finally cleared, the airship found that it had lost its place. The rules had completely changed. Jet aircraft matured quickly, flying faster and higher, and proving far better suited to modern warfare and modern transport. The rise of missile technology further transformed the meaning of power in the sky. At the same time, radar, air defense systems, and modern airport networks continued to develop, and the entire infrastructure of the aviation age began to reorganize itself around speed, efficiency, and rapid deployment. In such a world, the airship increasingly looked like a relic from another era. It was too slow, too large, too vulnerable to weather, and too poorly suited to a system that placed ever greater emphasis on fast response and efficient transport. By this point, the main line of the airship's real historical role had effectively been broken.
And yet, interestingly, being pushed to the margins of reality did not immediately end the airship's life in fantasy. It kept returning whenever some new technology appeared and reopened the imagination. One of the clearest examples was nuclear power. In that era, nuclear power was not just an energy technology, it was also a cultural illusion, a mass scientific euphoria. It made people believe that humanity was on the verge of limitless energy and that everything could be reconsidered and redefined. Cars, airplanes, ships, tanks, even household appliances were all imagined with nuclear hearts. And it was precisely in this atmosphere that the airship received another burst of imaginative life. In the United States, the Atoms for Peace movement of the 1950s helped drive this new wave of speculation. Illustrator Frank Tinsley, writing in Mechanics Illustrated, proposed a nuclear-powered airship imagined as a giant, peaceful, almost permanently cruising platform for air travel.
By the 1960s, the Soviet Union followed along a similar path, publishing its own concept for an atomic-powered airship in Technika Molodezi. The two visions were remarkably similar. Both attempted to give the airship a new heart, one that was nearly inexhaustible. In doing so, they tried to leap past all the old limitations of the airship and imagine something on an entirely different scale. Giant craft that no longer needed to land frequently, airborne platforms with full internal space and hangars, nuclear-powered monsters capable of cruising for immense periods of time with almost unlimited range. In this Cold War fantasy, the nuclear-powered airship was no longer just an aircraft. It became something closer to a utopian structure in the sky. The reactor seemed to erase the airship's most fatal limitations: range, resupply, loiter time, and operational scale. It could be larger, heavier, and stay aloft far longer, with interiors containing passenger cabins, cargo holds, command spaces, even hangars, like a moving city suspended high above the earth. But by this point, the airship was no longer a symbol of the future capable of igniting mass enthusiasm. The nuclear airship remained vast and dramatic, even more exaggerated than before, but it had clearly taken on a late, fading quality. Fewer and fewer people paid attention to it. It no longer belonged to a future imagined by everyone. It survived instead as the lingering afterimage of a small circle of engineering fantasies, science fiction magazines, and Cold War illusions. By this point, the airship seemed to have completed its history. It had once been a machine of adventure, then an airborne ocean liner, then a fortress of war, and finally, one of the last great sky structures of the nuclear age. In fantasy, it had been enlarged again and again. In reality, it had been left behind again and again by new technological orders. And yet, unexpectedly, once the 21st century began, this story, which seemed to be over, suddenly changed once more. Once the 21st century began, the airship did not disappear as completely as many people expected. What truly changed was the way it was imagined. In the past, airships were associated with transoceanic travel, aerial fortresses, mega-projects, and even nuclear utopias. Today, however, what brings them back into view is a completely different set of concerns. Carbon emissions, logistics in remote regions, oversized cargo, inadequate infrastructure, and last-mile delivery. That is why the most representative airship fantasy of this period is no longer about being faster, but about being more efficient. A good example is Na, proposed in 2008 by the Danish design team Kurt Thomsen. Its goal was very clear: not to create a beautiful futuristic airship for its own sake, but to solve the very practical problem of transporting large wind turbine components. It imagined using a giant cargo airship to move turbine parts directly from the manufacturing site to the installation site, reducing the complexity and cost of heavy overland transport and port transfers. A similar logic can be seen in Canada's Nanook, developed by Solarship. Officially described as a large cargo aircraft with a payload of up to 35,000 kilograms, its focus was not on fitting into the conventional airport system, but on providing low-cost transport in remote regions. It imagined a hybrid platform combining buoyancy, aerodynamic lift, and solar power, something that would not depend on full runways and would reduce reliance on fossil fuels and heavy infrastructure. If KNARR and Nanook represent one direction, the airship as a modern logistics tool, then Flying Yacht represents another kind of return. The airship does not necessarily have to become more powerful. It can also become slower, lighter, and more closely tied to experience itself. In Alcubierre's concept, This is a hybrid vehicle that has the appearance of an airship, but is not a traditional airship. It is designed to cruise at low altitude above the water, carry about 40 passengers, and serve mainly for sightseeing and coastal leisure travel. Rather than trying to prove itself more advanced than the airplane, it reimagines the airship as a slow vehicle of travel with a distinctly futuristic character. What is even more interesting is that today, even the most practical and cold-blooded logistics systems occasionally find themselves thinking about airships again. Amazon, for example, once filed its well-known Airborne Fulfillment Center patent. According to the concept, such an airborne warehouse could take the form of a high-altitude airship hovering at around 45,000 feet, with drones delivering products from that skyborne warehouse directly to customers. Of course, this never became a real Amazon fleet of airships, but the patent itself says a great deal. Even in an age dominated by algorithms, warehousing, and instant delivery, once people begin to rethink the structure of logistics, the airship reappears as a form of aerial infrastructure. The fantasy of the airship today is completely different from what it once was. It has become more practical, but also more fragmented. Some visions want to solve wind turbine transport. Some focus on logistics in remote regions. Some are about tourism and experience. Others exist only as airborne warehouses on patent drawings. The airship no longer corresponds to a single unified future. Instead, it has been broken into many possible answers to many specific problems. And that is precisely what makes it so interesting. Every time an era begins to rethink its logic of speed, cost, and infrastructure, the airship returns. It does not return in its old form, but it always reappears for new reasons, somewhere in the sketches of the future.
Airships may have an uncertain future, but the imagination around them will almost certainly continue, and it may continue in ways we do not expect. NASA, for example, has seriously studied the possibility of using airships in the skies of Venus. The reason is simple. Conditions on the surface of Venus are almost impossible for long-term human activity. But at an altitude of around 50 kilometers, the pressure and temperature become far more moderate. In that environment, an airship could actually become a viable platform for exploration. In other words, airships have not disappeared from the future. If anything, they have already been placed back into it, this time beyond Earth itself. What makes airships so captivating has never been flight alone, but the way they always seem to suggest that, wherever they exist, there might still be room for another way of living, another kind of order, another version of the future. That is why they keep disappearing and keep returning, not as the same machine each time, but as one of the most persistent and most romantic sketches people draw whenever they begin imagining the future again.